At midnight on October the 4th, as the nationwide invasion had officially kicked off with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, which had crippled ISR and communications capabilities for the defending forces, the electronic warfare assets in the DFW battle space, both the 59th PLA Group Army's Electronic Warfare Regiment, based on land, and the soon-to-arrive air power, namely the JH-7 strike aircraft, their KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, as well as also the H-6Ks, boasting these same systems, would effectively eliminate any redundant communications capabilities such as radio, as well as also redundant ISR capabilities such as multi-mission radars or portable air defense radars that were not dependent on satellite or the grid to function, as the cyber attacks had crippled the internet, telecom, military networks, and the grid. The lights were effectively out nationwide, and also the satellite capabilities, which America boasted the second largest military satellite contingency in the world, along with the largest contingent of commercial satellites, with China having the most military satellites and second most commercial satellites. They were now the leader in satellites after their hard kill anti-sat strikes had occurred after tracking all of the defending forces' satellites and effectively knocking them all out of the sky. As it pertained to the different operations which unfolded immediately at the strike of midnight, which included the massed artillery barrages that had initiated, along with enormous quantities of missile strikes from the strategic missile forces, namely the 3 brigades that were posted and allocated to the South Central Invasion Sector from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which were the 612th, 613th, and 616th, which the latter was in fact a Trojan unit, which was embedded within the nation in eastern Texas, had all been firing tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes all throughout the land, namely in the South Central Invasion Sector and even a bit beyond, as these strikes were all underway, and the arriving air armadas were now over American airspace and flying to their respective battle spaces, including those aircraft allocated specifically for the DFW battle. The heavy initiation of strikes were simply gargantuan, as many targets were simultaneously being wiped off the literal and proverbial map, although certain exceptions were made as it related to high-value targets, as there was a very high-profile operation that was also underway early in the invasion within the DFW battle space, and that was the operation to capture alive the leadership of the local defending forces, namely the commanding brigadier general of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. As it was common throughout the U.S. Army for full-bird colonels to command brigade-sized forces, it was also still the case that there were brigadier generals that also likewise commanded brigades in the U.S. Army, and the current commanding officer of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team was in fact at this moment in time a brigadier general, and he not only commanded his defending forces consisting of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, but the 2 attached battalions from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, which was the second of the 198th, as well as also a mobilized battalion from the Mississippi National Guard's 66th Troop Command, which was the first of the 204th, which in fact was a SHORAD, or Short-Range Air Defense Artillery Battalion. And as all of these forces were under the overall command of the leadership within the HHC, or Headquarters of Headquarters Company, over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, the men and women of this particular company were generally administrative forces, and they, alongside of them, had the Alpha Company, bivouacked with them of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, as these forces were in temporary bivouac locations both in north-central Arlington, just north of I-30, and also in northeast Arlington near the northwest corner of Grand Prairie, of northernmost Grand Prairie. These forces were bivouacked in lots that had been requisitioned for their use, whereupon they had pitched tents and effectively moved in their vehicles and created ad hoc motor pools for temporary storage of their vehicles. As initially, as the Sino-Russian naval drills occurred off both coasts, it was well known to the local population that the National Guard forces had been mobilized for the defense of critical sites throughout the city, and therefore the common travel that was occurring at midnight, right as the invasion had initially kicked off, was still in general progress as civilians drove to and fro throughout the city as they normally would be the case, although as the invasion had broken out, the 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, which for the express purpose of the DFW campaign had been attached to the PLA Reserve 59th Group Army, were the most rapid moving of the Army forces on the map, as their flight time by their Z-20 utility helos was exceedingly short, as it took them mere minutes, as in several minutes, to fly from their CCP regime property to downtown Fort Worth. And many commuters early on in the invasion, literally minutes in, had witnessed this occurrence, and as some of them had moved through northern Arlington, they had pulled off the road to inform the 949th Brigade Support Battalion elements of the Bravo and Delta Company, bivouacked 5 miles to the west of the HHC over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, who was bivouacked with the Alpha Company from the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, and had notified them as well of the goings-on exceedingly early in the invasion, literally minutes in, as they had moved through the area and seen the helo traffic landing in the Fort Worth area, both the Z-10 attack helo gunships of the Air Assault Battalion's Combat Aviation Company and the Z-20 utility helos ferrying in the troops of the Transport Helo Company within the Air Assault Battalion, tasked with the capture of the red zone in the downtown of the Fort Worth area as their primary objective. As other helos were spotted moving toward the international airport very early on, minutes in, from the same air assault forces, the same 83rd Air Assault Brigade, having committed 2 battalions to the assault over the DFW International Airport. The commuters, again, had notified the local defending forces, especially the command elements in the HHC, of the goings-on and the sightings that they had just witnessed mere minutes earlier, as they had effectively gone from I-820 onto I-30 and pulled off to inform these forces. And it took them only within the first 30 minutes to achieve this, as the communications again had been removed, all the lights had gone out, and the only lights spotted were the car lights of vehicles moving on the roads, at least within the first minutes of the invasion. Again, as the civilians had effectively been the only messengers able to inform these forces of what was going on, as they had spotted the air assault traffic. The HHC, in effect, had then sent a runner rapidly across the city 5 miles to inform the Bravo and Delta Company to, in effect, go to the southeast of the city of Fort Worth and meet them there, from where they would then go up I-820 and swing north after moving west to I-820 to get to the Naval Air Station, as they had figured that would be their best option for survival, as they were aware that some of their brigade's combat elements, along with the 1st of the 204th, were defending the area along with the considerable naval air power of the FA-18s at the Naval Air Station. However, in the first hour alone, the Naval Air Station was already under enormous assault from missile strikes, air strikes, even a strategic carpet munitioning raid that hit the Lockheed Martin plant and in effect destroyed much of the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion, as well as heavy artillery fire. Even artillery-based BRE-8 or Fire Dragon miniature tactical ballistic missile strikes hitting the Naval Air Station as well, in addition to hypersonic missiles even being utilized from across the border in Mexico from the 612th and 613 Strategic Missile Forces brigades in the form of the DF-17s with their DFCF hypersonic glide warheads and the DF-100 cruise missiles. As this was the plan initially, as the Brigadier General had effectively rounded up his local forces in their bivouac site and advised them to hurriedly flee. Also, before they managed to flee, satellite-guided artillery rounds fired from the one of two PLL-01 battalions struck the communications arrays or their communications tent and equipment and wiped out their communications personnel along with it, with these satellite-guided shells from the PLL-01s. 155mm satellite-guided ammunition struck these tents, destroyed the communications equipment and the personnel, as this was standard operating procedure to eliminate command and control elements, although the electronic warfare largely already had done this. Again, this was done out of SOP. Before the Alpha Company, HHC, and 5 miles away to the west, the Bravo and Delta Company were able to pack up and leave. By 12:30 a.m., these forces had miraculously managed to hurriedly move from their areas in the far north of Arlington into the southeast of the city of Fort Worth. And again, it always needs to be understood at all times. The PLA had total ISR dominance, as they could see every single solitary movement occurring within this metropolitan area, not to mention many others. And as they had everything from their quadcopter-based ISR capabilities all the way up to their multiple high-altitude reconnaissance drone capabilities, which scoured the entire metro area, all the way up to satellite, all overlaying to create a full three-dimensional mapping of the fluid, ever-changing, constantly moving battle space, as both Allied and enemy forces were plotted on the real-time mappings within the combat data links through the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which had as its eyes and ears effectively the ISR capabilities of the PLA and allies such as Russia, working together to map enormous swathes of the American nation for use through their real-time capabilities and creating pre-prepared strike packages for everything from artillery to airstrikes to missile strikes, all the way down to even fire support units using light artillery assets such as mortar systems and miniature rocket-based systems and others, as all of this firepower was simply gargantuan and highly focused. The reasoning for such limited strikes against the communications systems by single satellite-guided shells in each case was because, again, the leadership over all the defending forces throughout the Metroplex, namely the Brigadier General and his XO, which was a full bird colonel over the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, were seen as extremely high-value individuals and had immense intelligence value, as many high-ranking officials and officers do, and thus they were among the most wanted high-value individuals, or HVTs, high-value targets, and the commanding general and his staff were wanted alive if absolutely possible. And for such a high-profile operation, none other than the most elite troops of the 59th PLA Group Army, their wheel-based, largely, 59th Special Operations Battalion, as they could rapidly move with their assortment of MRAPs and Humvee-like vehicles, namely their EQ 2050s, which were China's answer to the American Humvee, which was a miniature, high-mobile military vehicle, whereas they also had their MRAPs, such as their VP3s, or Tiger MRAPs, and these, just like the American Max Pro MRAP, were made to protect the crews from explosions that happened outside of the vehicle from improvised devices, or even in some cases, explosions from actual military-grade explosives, as well as also being able to sustain mine hits and protect the crew inside the cab, leaving them alive. However, anti-armor weaponry could, in effect, defeat these vehicles just like it could American MRAPs, especially if hit in the proper places. Although this was the case, these vehicles allowed a high degree of mobility for the PLA Special Operations Forces between their MRAPs and also their EQ 2050 vehicles, which in some ways did appear similar to the American Humvee, although there were slight differences, as these forces were literally guided into the area to surround the American support forces as the men and women that comprised the Bravo and Delta Company of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, as well as also its Alpha Company, and also those of the Independent Company, known as the Headquarters of Headquarters Company, which was in command over the entire brigade, the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, and also with it, the two additional mobilized battalions, the 1st of the 204th and 2nd of the 198th. The command elements, as they were seen moving the entire step of the travel, as every step of the way had been monitored as they traveled into this area of the city, allowed through the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system for these special operations forces to see exactly where these forces were at all times, and allowed for them to interdict them, as in race into the city and surround these forces, which they had managed to do, as it took 30 minutes for these forces to travel into this part of the city. It equally took the 59th the same amount of time to interdict them, and then it took them another hour, in effect, to totally surround them, as they were surrounding a somewhat large area with just their battalion. To their immediate south, on their flanks, other combat was going on in the southern suburb of Fort Worth known as Burleson, as the 16th Infantry Division had one of its two armored battalions seizing control of a major interstate intersection, which included a considerable stretch of I-35W, which was a major invasion route, as I-35, both I-35E and W for east and west, were part of the same highway, as they co-joined once again in the city of Gainesville, and also to the south in the city of Hillsborough. And the external components, as per fourth-generation warfare military doctrines, were using this as a key invasion route to drive rapidly and deep into the country before shedding off group armies and spreading out. As also in the north, coming down from Canada, the same was the case with the same highway, I-35. And as these forces were seizing control of every segment of this vital invasion route through this massive node known as the DFW metro area, including also I-35E, the fighting in this area revolved around American militia-type forces just outside of Burleson, receiving news of sightings of PLA troops by common travelers. As word spread among the civilian population, these armed reactionary militia-type forces ended up trying to attack a mechanized infantry battalion of the 16th Infantry Division, holding a considerable portion of the highway where they would be crushed, as also the armored battalion moving in to seize the vital intersection of I-20 and also I-35E would also defeat other armed reactionary civilian elements in the area to the immediate south of the area of operations wherein the Special Operations Battalion of the 59th PLA Group Army would be operating. In this particular image, Type 88C main battle tanks are breaking on through this fence onto this access road by I-35E and are in effect defeating, wiping out armed reactionary civilian forces that were in their way. There's also the armored infantry forces, as there were two armored infantry companies in each armored battalion, with the 4-tank, 1 anti-tank company, which was effectively the fire support assets of the armored battalion, launching their long-range ATGMs, which are also quite powerful, the HJ-10s, at enemy forces and enemy targets in the area. The armored battalion was a very potent fighting force indeed for the use in this area, as also there was, again, to their south, in the southernmost end of Burleson, a mechanized infantry battalion also seizing control of I-35E and fending off armed reactionary civilian militia-type forces, in doing so with ease, as again, the PLA had total ISR dominance, total AI and IT dominance, and they had vastly heavier firepower and concentrated numbers in small areas, which made for immensely destructive combat scenarios wherein the PLA simply wiped out all in their wake, especially with their enormous artillery firepower dominance, as well as also their air dominance and enormous aerial firepower platforms, and also their missile platforms and missile dominance, as well as also the built-in fire support company in each mechanized infantry battalion with their 130mm Type 63 light artillery MLRS systems and their heavy 120mm dual-purpose assault gun / mortar systems, the PLL-05s, which also, with their massive array of CH-901 loitering munitions, simply annihilated all in their wake. As the Special Operations Forces had rapidly moved into this part of the city in the southeast of Fort Worth to interdict, cut off, surround, and ultimately mop up the elements of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion while trying to surgically remove alive the commanding elements of the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, as these were very high-value targets. The Special Operations Forces, being the most elite of all the forces on the literal and proverbial map of the PLA, were the best choice for this operation, as they could get this job done. As the only other forces on the map that were anything close to what the Special Operations Forces were as far as their elite status were the quasi-elite 83rd Air Assault Brigade, but they had other missions to tend to, and the 59th Special Operations Battalion of the PLA's 59th Group Army, as the 83rd Air Assault Brigade was part of the 83rd Active Duty Group Army, were chosen to conduct this operation and capture these forces alive, as these were very high-value individuals in terms of their intelligence value, and they also even had the secondary mission of ensuring that a segment of I-30 was absolutely secure as a secondary objective of the Special Operations Forces in their particular area of operations, as although this was not the main invasion route like I-35 was, this was a logistical and potential troop movement route for the occupation to follow the invasion, and this was highly coveted by the local invasion, soon-to-be occupation forces. Although the primary objective, at least in this part of the city, again, was the absolute capture of the high-ranking individuals, especially the Brigadier General of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, whose intelligence value cannot be understated, and even into the occupation would still serve as a useful intelligence tool through interrogations, as would many other higher-ranking officers, as many of the partisan forces that would arise out of the ashes of defeat would also have ties to the former military of the American regime, and thus the former officers would prove valuable in the effort to gain intelligence on these forces and assist in crushing them over time. As the 59th had again moved into the area by 1 a.m. and then had begun to surround the area, which would be achieved by 2, as again the companies would all surround the area relatively quickly, but then because this was a battalion, they would have to disperse their dismounts to ensure that the area was thoroughly cordoned, not just by their vehicle-based assets, but also by dismounting their forces to plug up every single solitary street, alley, and building on the actual cordon as they envelop the area. And in order to do so, as such, they would move their companies into specific areas of the cordon and then dismount their troops, who would then spread out and ensure the area was thoroughly surrounded. As the combat initiated just after 1 a.m., as the first 2 companies of the battalion to arrive, of its 6 total companies of operators, along with their headquarters company of the battalion, headquarters and support company, which was command and logistics, and also their heavy special weapons company, which included a mortar platoon for their heavier firepower, as well as also a robotics platoon with combat robots, 15 of them to be exact, and also they had an FPV drone and sniper spotter platoon as their third combat platoon of their heavy special weapons company. All of these forces were very technologically advanced in that they used robots and FPV drones, as well as also integrating snipers into their support system along with mortars, made these special operators a devastating fighting force, along with their expertise in shooting, as these were some of the best shooters of any military anywhere in the world. And the PLA's training for their special operations forces was rigorous, to be sure. These troops were experts at shooting on the move and at moving targets, as most common troops went to ordinary firing ranges and practiced their tactical maneuvers and tactical shooting. These forces of the special operations troops throughout the PLA had it down to an exact science, as they were some of the best of the PLA's special operations forces. They would conduct this operation and do it with a level of precision and be exceedingly methodical as how they went about it, that the entire operation would last between 1 and 4:30 a.m., or simply just a matter of 3.5 hours. Joining them would be a single company from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 16th ID that had surrounded and effectively cleared and destroyed a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians trying to hold out in the Cowboys Stadium in Arlington, in West Arlington. And as they only used 3 of their combat companies from their battalion in this endeavor, as well as also using their fire support company within their battalion to support them, they still had 3 unused mechanized infantry companies of their battalion, and they would send one in as potential reinforcements, though they would not be needed. They would still be sent regardless, as this order came directly from the top, from the headquarters of headquarters battalion over the entire PLA 59th Group Army. As this operation to capture the commanding general alive was a very high-profile operation and had to be done with a high degree of efficiency that was not necessarily required for many of the other operations occurring concurrently to this one. As this again began at 1 a.m., it started by the surrounding of the area, which lasted until 2 a.m., a full hour, as this was a large area, and only a battalion and initially was surrounding it, as the additional mechanized infantry company from the nearby mechanized infantry battalion of the 16th ID in West Arlington would not arrive until 3:40 a.m., or merely 50 minutes before the battle would be ended and the general would be captured alive. This mission would be a resounding success, and not only the general, but his XO and many of his staff members would be taken alive, although many of the logistical troops, support troops of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion that also entered the area, including from Alpha Company, Bravo, and Delta, would mostly be wiped out. As the PLA Special Operations Forces moved into the area, as the air power would arrive, though it would be available, it would not be utilized, as there would be J-11 fighters passing over the immediate area. Though they would not be utilized, they would just be conducting their combat air patrols, but would be available if needed to drop their 2 laser-guided precision munitions in support of the ground troops, the special operations troops. Again, they would not be needed for this, and they could go about conducting their combat air patrols and air superiority operations, as they, again, would be over this immediate area, just a pair of J-11s from the J-11 squadron of the PLAAF that was arriving into the battle space, and the special operations forces would have even more surgical support from 2 Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones that would fly over the area and support them with ATGMs, as this was more surgical than the air power, as these weapons were less destructive and were more accurate in terms of the level of destruction they produced, as in they produced much less destruction than a pair of laser-guided 1,000-pound munitions, and were a more surgical weapon in order to simply destroy individual vehicles or small groupings of enemy personnel, or individual buildings rather than an entire city block. As the troops, again, surrounded the area completely by 2 a.m., the initial combat began as the area was being surrounded as one company out of the 6 companies of operators, along with their heavy special weapons company, with their headquarters and support company staying out and away from the combat action, as this was the command and logistical assets of the forces who would provide the logistical support to the troops as they operated in the area. One company would clash as they moved in the northern part of the cordon against Bravo Company of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion. Again, as the area had been thoroughly surrounded by the Special Operations troops, they would also have immense artillery support, and they would receive it from firing batteries within 2 of the rocket battalions of the 122 millimeter Type 83 MLRS battalions, which operated these systems, which were part of the PHL-81 family of MLRS platforms. These were an upgrade as the Type 83s. These would lay down a relatively large barrage that would blanket a large area, destroying Delta Company and 300 armed reactionary civilians, as there was a total of 550 armed reactionary civilians within this pocket. And in this part of the city, many could consider this the hood, as the saying went, as there were public housing projects, hole-in-the-wall clubs, and bars. There were also many dollar stores and low-budget food marts and gas stations, and the houses ranged from suburban-type housing all the way to shotgun shacks, as they were called. And as the general found himself in this unflattering area, he ended up moving in to the public housing projects in an area known as Stop 6 in Fort Worth. As in this area, there was a public housing project just south of I-30, and the general, seeing as the brick buildings could resist some types of small arms fire, had deemed them the most efficient place to set up a temporary command post, as he discovered quickly that his forces were surrounded, and also as they moved into the area, they became separated, as there was no communications, and this caused forces to either bunch up or end up becoming broken off of the main body of forces, and he, with his HHC elements and some of Alpha Company elements, would end up in this area of the city. To the north, the 122 millimeter multiple launch rocket strikes would come in heavy and hard and blanket an area a mile in length north to south and approximately a kilometer in total width east to west, as they would destroy Delta Company in this barrage and gradually pick apart many other defenders, namely armed reactionary civilians in their hundreds, while killing non-combatants in the tens of thousands, as the PLA did not purposely go after non-combatants, although the PAP did, which was a brutal paramilitary force within the Chinese armed forces. The PLA generally tried, if possible, to avoid non-combatant fatalities, although it was not always possible, as they had to destroy the armed defending forces, and they viewed any non-combatant deaths as simple collateral damage. They did not, in effect, lose any sleep over it, as the saying went, but they did not purposely go after non-combatants. But in this instance, thousands of them would be wiped out in this small barrage conducted by several firing batteries of 2 different rocket battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigades, Type 83 battalions, as they had 2 battalions each of the towed howitzers, the 152 millimeter PLL-66s and the 155 millimeter PLL-01s. That's again another PLL-66 battalion, PLL-01 battalion, and their heaviest artillery forces in this battle space, the 300 millimeter PHL-03 battalion, also was a part of the 19th Artillery Brigade, with their headquarters and support battalion being the command and logistical elements of the brigade. As all of these artillery forces were monstrously destructive, they would raise enormous parts of the Metroplex to the ground in a matter of minutes, and would continue firing all throughout the campaign. And as mentioned before, artillery work is heavy work, and these troops would require a long rest after their enormous amount of fire missions put down in the field, as the fire missions would be a continuous phenomena throughout this entire nationwide invasion. as the Special Operations Forces moved in their wheeled vehicles, both their VP3 Tiger MRAPs, as well as also their EQ 2050 or Humvee-like vehicles. Again, they had rapidly surrounded the area, which was thoroughly complete by 2 a.m., as again they dismounted their squads from their MRAPs and EQ 2050s, and many of the EQ 2050s had open backs with additional seating to hold additional troops so they could fit an entire squad, or some of the EQ 2050s carried both the armed and unarmed robots of the Heavy Special Weapons Company, which would participate in this battle, as the forces would again be conducting a surgical strike, a very thorough, methodical operation. This operation, to be conducted properly and accurately, would again take a total of 3.5 hours, as the rocket artillery picked apart many enemies. There would still be combat on the ground, as the northernmost end of the cordon, as there was 2 other companies surrounding this area, spread out in the north, and the other 3 spread out around the bottom, with the Heavy Special Weapons Company breaking off and assisting these different regular operator companies with their mortars, their sniper spotter teams, FPV drone operators, and armed robot forces. These forces would smash their way through the area, but do it in a very surgical way, as they had top-notch intelligence of where the general was at all times, as again their ISR capabilities had been monitoring all of the movements of all of these forces, so they knew the relative position of the general and had in effect been monitoring his exact vehicle in their procession of vehicles racing into this part of the city, as again they were trying to conduct a detour around downtown Fort Worth, as they had the reports coming in from ordinary civilian travelers moving through the area, having had spotted the helo traffic over this area, causing them to want to swing to the south and then west and then north to get to the Naval Air Station and White Settlement instead of going the more direct route through downtown, this causing them to be interdicted by the Special Operations Battalion, specifically sent in as the air assault troops were operating in the downtown of Fort Worth, the special operators being sent in specifically to deal with the HHC and also the logistical forces of non-combat troops, as most were non-combat troops unless they had been part of combat units and reclassed to different MOSs and ended up in these logistical forces of the 949th. These forces would, despite being non-combat troops up against elite hardened combat, elite Special Operations Forces, would try to put up the best fight they could, and they would indeed try to fight tenaciously, but for the most part would be brutally annihilated in the process, as combat would eventually take the special operators into the projects to ferret out the leadership of the HHC, who would be hiding out in one of the project buildings, as the projects at this time were largely abandoned, as many of the residents had long since departed the area as the fighting grew very intense, and even in the neighborhoods around the area, many were in hiding or had tried to flee. And as the special operators, again, tried to avoid non-combat fatalities as much as possible, those that were deemed as not being threats were generally allowed out of the cordons, and those seen with arms in hand and deemed as threats were generally annihilated, as again, there were 550 armed reactionary civilian elements in this pocket, and all of them would be wiped out between a combination of the heavy rocket artillery fire from 122mm multiple launch rocket salvos, or the special operators laying down heavy concentrated 12.7mm machine gun fire, along with other weapons used, as in their convoys of MRAPs and EQ 2050 vehicles, the gunners had staggered weapons, of course, and had interlocking fields of fire between every other vehicle, like so, and they could concentrate fire on any area where their quadcopter ISR assets in the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had spotted enemy personnel. And of course, they carried ATGMs aboard their vehicles as well, such as HJ-08s, and also a large quantity of Type 69-I, or just Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades for short, in the short term. As the Type 69-I, or 1, or simply just called the Type 69 for short, was a still highly effective anti-armor weapon. Although it could not do much to many main battle tanks, it was highly effective against light armored vehicles, and also had the option of anti-personnel rockets, which made this a very suitable weapon for the type of combat unfolding in this area. As we go to this particular image, a special operations squad with 3 members getting atop an area that had been hit by an 82mm mortar and blown much of the top floor out and bottom floor walls in the entire roof. Still, with a ledge to effectively get atop of, these 3 squad members, having gotten on top of this at one point two-floor building, are laying down fire on Max Pro MRAPs of the logistical and support troops of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, who again would try to put up a tenacious fight to resist the invasion forces of the Special Operations troops of the 59th Special Operations Battalion in this area, although the high-tech Special Operations troops, with their array of different weapons types, such as their armed quad-legged robots with heavy machine guns, 12.7 millimeters, their FPV drones, their mortar strikes from 82mm mortars, which would pulverize buildings and destroy light-skinned vehicles with ease, would simply rain down mass destruction on the area. And again, they had artillery support at their beckon and call. And they also, of course, had air power available as well, such as their armed Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drones, which effectively were flying missile-carrying vehicles, and also, if needed, air support, although this would not be required, as these elite troops would only have several wounded and a few KIAs throughout this entire operation. This would be a resounding success, as these troops were, again, the best of the best that the PLA had to offer, as they did have active duty special operations forces that were even more elite. These troops were still the perfect fit for this type of operation, as the sniper spotter teams were also phenomenal shooters. They too would aid the operations of the standard operators in battle heavily, as they would wipe out many targets in the wake of the combat operation, as the special operators would be doing as other PLA troops and raiding many buildings in the area, such as this rolling T formation. Of course, they would also clear other areas in wedge formations, and staggered column and double column and single column formations, and even in some cases diamond formations whenever and wherever possible, as they had different tactical formations for different situations, such as in this image here, where a squad of special operators had just effectively cut this armed reactionary civilian down, leading to rounds smacking into this steel reinforced concrete wall above the sidewalk here. And of course, the armed quad-legged robot had fired at this wall as well, as this man was running through the area, eventually getting cut down by the troops. In their wedge formation, there's more troops just off this illustration or animation in this wedge formation. Of course, their squad leader would be in the middle of the wedge, running with them. This point man had also cut this man down across the overpass of I-30 below. So this was a sign on the highway, the lights being out at this time, because again, the grid went down. As the combat would wear on, many vehicles would be abandoned on the highways and streets, and others would be outright destroyed in the crossfire that would be occurring, as mortars would strike and destroy buildings and even set some ablaze, as they could ignite propane canisters and natural gas lines and lead to fires. The heavy fire from the quad-legged robot taking position behind this steel-reinforced concrete wall here on the street was laying down fire support so that the wedge could cross the highway and get to the next area, as this man's cranium is literally exploding after being hit by a 12.7 millimeter round. These 2 armed reactionary civilians, having moved into this area, are trying to take cover behind the ledge, but soon they too will join this man, as this robot's firepower is simply far too heavy for them to resist. The squad-level quadcopter assets, of course, would be patrolling ahead, mapping out the area in real time, discovering enemy positions. And this would also assist the support forces of the heavy special weapons companies, such as the FPV drone operators, in where to send their FPV drones to destroy enemy personnel. And as all of this combat would be underway, this light post was destroyed from some of the residual effects of the mortar strikes in the nearby area. As the combat would unfold, the stack teams would be going through buildings like so, as the breach man came around, kicked the door open, was not flagging his troops, pointing his weapon this way, about to go back and get in the back of the stack team. As this was a small room, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had real-time intelligence on all of the buildings and the sizes of rooms and even the street maps and also maps of rural areas and more, the planning was tailored, and aid from the real-time AI battlefield data system allowed for these troops to move in a highly efficient manner, whether they were elite PLA troops or simple infantry troops. And in this case, as elite PLA troops would be conducting these same operations, if there were small rooms, they would tailor their stack team planning in accordance with this, like sending in only 2 troops into a small room instead of the entire stack team, and then moving on and possibly using grenades in larger areas or in areas where the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had deemed it appropriate. As these forces had cleared this room and wiped out this individual, they would then continue on and clear the rest of the rooms of the building and hallways and every nook and cranny in the building until it was clear. And then they would emerge and move on to the next site. As the projects would be cleared in this way, such as in this image where this squad was moving in a staggered column formation and temporarily stopped to break off to allow their stack team from half of this squad to clear this building, while this stack team would proceed in after this grenade into the window had blasted, thrown by the last man in this side of the squad. Again, they were moving originally in a staggered column formation where this soldier would have been on this side, there would have been one here, one here, one here, and one there. But again, this squad broke into 2 half-squad stack teams to clear these 2 project buildings. And as all of the vehicles of the Alpha Company and HHC would be methodically destroyed in a very surgical way, this particular MRAP having been hit by an anti-armor round and having blown out part of the engine and the hood right off the vehicle and thrown it in this direction, causing the vehicle to smoke and maiming the driver and gunner inside of the vehicle, they would be captured eventually, while others would be either wiped out or captured who put up resistance, and the process would repeat itself as initially the vehicles would be destroyed by everything from HJ-08 ATGMs to aerial-based ATGMs, such as the 2 HJ-10s being fired from this Wingling 2. Also, by the time of this map, which the map of the Stop 6 area down here and just south of I-30 would occur after the northern area was thoroughly flushed out between a combination of artillery barrage from rocket artillery and a single company, one of 3 in the north, pressing through the area to engage and destroy the Bravo Company of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, along with a large number of armed reactionary civilian elements who would be hit with a variety of mortars, as well as sniper spotter team fire, armed combat robot fire, and dismounted elite special forces operator-based fire as they move through in their tactical formations, along with their heavy vehicle-based support from these MRAPs and also the EQ 2050s, which also had heavy machine guns and other types of weapons mounted aboard. As the projects were in a hilly area, as there were yards and hills surrounding the area, as well as parking areas amid the buildings, the general had decided that this would have been the most defendable spot to effectively move into to set up his command post. The G is for the brigadier general's position, and this project building would be raided and he would be captured along with his XO and other high-ranking members of his inner circle of his HHC company, effectively. And as the forces, again, of the Americans, the Alpha, Bravo, and Delta Company, had effectively broken apart throughout a relatively large area, as this was a 1 mile by 1 mile area, and this being a 1.5 mile by 1 mile area north to south, 1.5 east to west. To the south of this area was this neighborhood, which was on hilly terrain. It's the old schoolhouse. These were suburban type of houses that were a bit nicer than the houses on the other side of the highway, but nonetheless, this area would be swept through by this same company moving into the south, sending their dismounts into the area, along with members of the fire support elements, the mortar platoon of the Heavy Special Weapons Company, also moving to the area, setting up around the old schoolhouse with more just to the north of their platoon from their Heavy Special Weapons Company, and also deploying 10 of their 15 armed combat robots of the Heavy Special Weapons Company into this area as well to assist in the capture thereof. As the Mechanized Infantry Company from the 16th Infantry Division's Mechanized Infantry Battalion that had taken the football stadium and the surrounding area, as they had sent in one of their unused companies as potential reinforcements, would arrive at 3:40, as that is when this map begins. And this map initiates at 1 a.m. The details and tactical aspects of the fighting itself will all be conveyed in the following video, as all of the specific tactical movements of the forces on the ground, including their fire support assets, whether they're FPV drones, their later to come loitering munitions, as the headquarters and support company of the 59th also, again, were the operators of the TEL-based 48-tubed CH-901A system, as when this map initially begins, these forces had just began cordoning the area, and the the headquarters and support company had not yet arrived and just off the map and were not yet able to fire their CH-901As. However, as soon as this map concludes, the first volley of CH-901As will have been fired, and they would assist in also surgically annihilating all the vehicles, not just in the projects, but also in the metal recycling plant in the area where other Alpha Company forces and HHC forces had ended up becoming trapped in during this operation, as well as other areas of this Stop 6 area in the south, as well as also a shopping center and a vehicle repair center. And all of this, again, was on hilly terrain in the area. The area had many shifting hilly terrain features, and also there was a large hill right here. The streets effectively moved down into this area, and the projects had hills around them and were in a hilly area in general. And some of the hills and the terrain features in this area provided some protection from direct fire from small arms, and the brick buildings somewhat aided in defense from small arms fire, but heavier weapons such as 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, whether aboard vehicles or aboard the combat robots, would shred right through these buildings. But again, great care would be taken to conduct this operation in a very precise and surgical way. Again, no extremely heavy weapons, as in artillery fire, no missile strikes, no airstrikes on the projects would occur, and instead only mortar fire, as well as loitering munition strikes, FPV drone strikes, and also HJ-10 strikes from a Wing 2 dedicated combat drone, along with these special forces operators using their Type 69 RPGs and HJ-08 man portable ATGMs to destroy these vehicles would actually occur, as this was one platoon that had maneuvered through the area to surround the projects and move in to capture the command staff of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team's HHC, as again, fighting would be heavy in the projects. The area was mostly deserted by civilian occupants, non-combatants, and was now occupied by U.S. Army forces, as again, they had nowhere to go. They knew they were surrounded, as they had bumped into special operators conducting the cordon and had decided on staying in the projects. And this is where they would make their final stand, but the general would be captured. And all of this will be covered in the following video of part 10. as the tactical aspects and movements on the maps will be covered in far more detail. Again, fighting in this area would be very methodical and surgical, and it would take 3.5 hours to conclude, which, all things considered, for a high profile, extremely rigorous, demanding operation such as this, that was still conducted in rapid time. More to come in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. As part 10, 2 of 2, will continue with the map-based tactical movements and operations.